Hello, folks.
Hello, Dave. How are we doing today?
I'm good. Arthur. I've literally just come through the door. My daughter did her graduation today, so that was very exciting. I'm slightly wet, but I only had one glass of wine, so I'm okay. Thank you. How are you?
Okay, that's good. There seems to be some funny feedbacky soundy thing. Are you finding that? Or is that just me?
I'm not hearing it from my end.
Okay. Dave, you introduce us. I'm going to have to go out and come back in, okay?
Okay. Well, my esteemed colleague, Mr. Arthur Motley, is out of the building. I can introduce what Liquid Antiquarian is all about. Arthur and I are indeed antiquarians. We are not historians. We are perhaps wannabe historians. And earlier on this week, we were told we were almost historians by Neil Mackenzie, Professor Neil Mackenzie, and Dr. Nick Morgan. But we are antiquarians. We like stuff. We like objects. We like old pieces of paper. We like old, semi-forgotten or perhaps mistold stories about the world of drink. And this week, and indeed beginning of last week, we've been exploring in some forensic detail this wonderful book here, which has just been published, The Distilleries of Great Britain and Ireland, 1922 to 1929. If you haven't got yourself a copy, get one now. Published by James Eadie, an incredible editing job done by Leon Kubler, and a great introduction by our dear friend Tom Bruce-Gardine. And this is an absolute, an amazing reference for what was happening at this really, really vitally important time in the evolution of Scotch whisky. Beginning of the week, we had a chat with Professor Neil and Dr. Nick, looking at it in terms of historical context. What was the Scotch whisky industry like at this particular time? What were the pressures upon it? There was lots of consolidation. There were lots of distillery closures. I mean, 38 of the distilleries profiled in the book closed, actually probably during the time that the book was being pulled together, or the individual articles in the book were being. So an industry struggling, perhaps, certainly at the cusp of change. You're seeing DCL beginning to grow in strength. You're seeing new avenues beginning to be explored. You're seeing the closure of Campbellton, for example, but also you're beginning to see the introduction of new technology. Very, very interesting new ways in those days of making whiskey. So this is very much the time where the modern whiskey industry, I think it's fair to say, Arthur, the modern whiskey industry, which we recognize now in terms of equipment and approach, was beginning to evolve. So it was a fascinating insight in terms of the historical context. But tonight we're going to be doing something different. We're going to be geeking out. We're going to be going deeper into process and how whiskey was made in those days, according to the book. Is that fair?
That's very fair, Dave. So I just need to explain that I'm hearing three Daves, and there's a lag, so it's very, very difficult. And now I'm hearing my own voice, which is incredibly distracting. So I'm going to shrink into the background. Dave, I'll click the buttons. Okay.
Okay, Arthur, that's great. I hope that nobody else is hearing three of me. It's bad enough hearing one of me. But tonight, I would just like to say welcome our two guests, who I believe are lurking backstage. We have Alan Winchester and Robert Fleming. And look, there's Alan Winchester and there's Robert Fleming. Hello, boys. How are we doing?
I'm good, Dave. And you?
You're good. Excellent. Are you on your phone, or have you managed to get us?
No. I've banned my good lady from the iPad and the computer, so all the juice is coming to this laptop.
Excellent. And Alan, how are you doing?
I'm very well, and can I add my congratulations to Rosie on her graduation? Yeah, very special day. So congratulations. Yeah. And I'm doing well. I've got a nice drama, James Eadie's X brand, which came in the post this week. So very much appreciated. A nice hint of peat to it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting drama, and actually the story, it was appropriate that we chose this, because the book kind of came out of this drama, to be perfectly honest, because Rupert was delving into the history, of James Eadie, ancestor of his, and a few years back, it was trying to kind of recreate the old brand, and then Leon kind of took the bit between his teeth and actually began to look even further into what the world around that brand at those days would have looked like, and that's how this book ended up in existence. So it's very appropriate that we have a drama of this excellent blend.
I fixed it.
Excellent. Welcome back.
It's really obvious. If anyone's interested, I also had YouTube open and there's a 3-second delay. So I was listening to YouTube as our viewers are watching it, and I was listening to you in live. So there's a little.
I'm delighted you're back with us.
It was painful.
What's going to happen today? So.
Yeah, we've had a busy day. So, well, I did plan to just introduce a little bit myself following the Historians episode, which I absolutely loved. And they covered this tension between the old and the new, which is a fascinating thread that runs through the book. And that's nicely summed up by this slide here that we saw with the horse and cart and the motorized truck in front of it. And, there's some beautiful snapshots of an older world. So this is not from the book. This is estimated from 1902 to 1905. It's from a private set of photographs in a photograph album. Look at all those horses outside Glenlivet, really beautiful. And one of the things I felt we didn't quite cover was barley. There is barley everywhere. That was one of the first things I thought of when I saw the book and flicked through all this amazing barley everywhere that is, with the exception of some distilleries, kind of hidden. And then we saw a snapshot of it there in the old, I think they're called ricks, aren't they? In front of that beautiful picture.
Stooks. That's a stook.
Stook, I beg your pardon, stook.
Right.
And that rather romantic postcard from 1912 that shows that really nicely. And when I was looking into that, I think we get loads of great feedback from the people who watch Liquid Antiquarian, how it's triggering to people, how to look into little bits of research. And so I went digging around. And I had expected, actually, Dr. Nick, to talk about barley and how we couldn't necessarily trust everything that was said in the book. And I think Glenvaux was one distillery that struck me, and they mentioned the best barley coming in from Leith, and I can't remember where else by sea they said, but coming in from roundabout. So I had a little look because I had access to some beautiful old documents, actually from the year that the entry is for Glenvaux, for 1924, and I'm going to just show you 3 there, because obviously, when I first saw that barley, I could imagine lots of whiskey fans talking about, a sense of place, Dave.
That's a good title for a book, actually.
It is a good title for a book. and seeing all this barley kind of really is something that you don't see so much there. But here we see some Scotch malt coming in from Kirkcaldy up to Inverness. But also, same distillery. This is actually slightly earlier in the year, from Karachi, which I'd heard about barley from Karachi being a thing. But then this one surprised me. Algerian barley. That's from, again, earlier in the year. So early in the year there, they seem to be importing barley. And then later in the year, they're taking it in from Scotland. Just one distillery across a 6-month period. So I'm not necessarily thinking about this kind of, these are very modern distilleries in many ways, that they are importing things from many, many places. And that really struck me. And then I came across this other thing that I thought was interesting. If you're talking about the tension between the old and the new, and I think we were talking Nick was quite rightly talking about modernisation. I thought this from Dublin City Distillery. I've just highlighted that. No acids used, nor yeast manufactured. You have this time where you get distilleries also doing other things, and they are making vast quantities of yeast for the bread making industry, I think. And there's a distillery saying, effectively, we're not one of those distilleries. We're just making whiskey. I thought that was interesting. Anyhow, I'm aware that lots of people are spurred on by this book or different elements of liquid antiquarian. So before that technical hitch, I just wanted to do that. And then, actually, Dave, as a little surprise to you, I thought you might like to give away 2 signed copies of your upcoming book, A Sense of Place.
I would indeed. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've got 2 things. One, which I think we've got an answer. We should be able to get an answer, and one might be a bit more tricky. First of all, Robert, we've got Bobby's teaser. Now, what is your teaser, Bobby? And can people in the comments, we'll come back to it at the end of the show. What is your teaser, Bobby?
What I was looking at was above the washbacks, there seems to be a sort of an array of looks like wires hanging down like a crown over the washbacks. I wasn't sure whether they were spraying water. I have no idea what they were for. So hopefully somebody that's out in the, I don't know how many people are listening into this, but hopefully somebody out there, before Alan Winchester steps in and tells me, I hope somebody out there can fill me in as to what these, I don't know what they are. They look like wires hanging down just above the washbacks.
Right.
Okay, I thought you knew the answer to that one, Robert. When
no,
you
I've
said
no
that.
idea. When I opened up this book, I mean, I was fascinated by all the photographs, and it was one of these things, where I don't go to art galleries very often, but when you look at a painting, you look at it and go, oh, a nice painting. But then the more you study it, the more sort of questions come into your mind as to, what's the background to this or whatever. And I was fascinated by a lot of these photographs as to, yeah, they're nice photographs, but when you look beyond or even behind the photographs as to what was there. And I took this book on holiday with me to Ireland. I think this might be the only version of the Stories of Great Britain and Ireland that's been to both in the last 2 weeks. So I took this book with me to Ireland, and I spent God knows how long just looking at these photographs and looking behind the photographs as to what I didn't know about. So that was the one at Speyburn was the one that I have no idea. And there's another comment, but Alan filled me in this a couple of nights ago. There was a thing, I think it was in Stromness, that there was a list of all the which they had to do, a list of all the plant that the revenue or the customs and excise at that time you had to show to them. And there was a washback, and then there was a jackback before the wash charger. And I've only been in the business 48 years. I hadn't a clue what a jackback was. So Alan was filling me in that one, so maybe he can explain a bit more about that one.
Okay, so Alan, can I ask, do you know the answer to Bobby's teaser, or whatever I called it?
I can have a guess.
Okay, well, you're looking the judge.
There's an old saying, and it applies to anything. That the past's a different country. They do things different there. I have probably a guess at what it is. Yes.
Okay. Well, we've got a second.
Answers the postcard, please.
I want to win the prize.
Right. And Alan, do you want to introduce Winchester's Puzzler?
Winchester's Puzzler. Well, I've been spending the last few weeks taking the magnifying glass to the pictures. But this is something I've always been aware of, that a lot of the distilleries have codes. There's a W code off the Parkmore mash tun. There's an A code off the stills at Glenlivet. A D code, that could be Longmorn. A K, that could be Cardew or Macallan. And a W code Again, that I've seen at, I think, Inchgower and Balvenie, and I think Balvenie still uses it in the casks, or certain recent casks. I once asked an exciseman, was this code an excise code for the stations, because they were all split up? But the exciseman said no, because he told us at Glenfarclas to stop using the A in the casks. And I'm actually not sure what it is. Oh, you've got them written there, Strathd. Yeah, that was fascinating to see that. It does a car. I thought Cardew, well, that's a corruption of K, Cardew. But the A appears at Glenlivet, Glengrant, Scapa, Aberlour, things like that. B will appear at Bunnahaven, things like that. So that's my mystery. I don't know. Was it an excise requirement, or is it an early marking of postmark? Dalmore used to put like 2 crosses on the cask. I don't know if that's anything to do with it.
Yeah,
so that's Winchester's puzzler.
Okay, the centre bottom one, I've made a typo on that. I think that's Glenside, which is in Campbelltown.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, and there's a few more in there. Ben Romack I came across at the last minute as well. So, a signed copy of Dave's book that he didn't realise he was giving away before tonight. Royal Malt Whiskies will pay the shipping, Dave. Don't worry.
Excellent. Well, yeah. Well, answers in the comments section. Nice to see so many friends already turning up. Before we jump in, I just wanted to maybe build on that what you were talking about barley there, Arthur. I mean, gentlemen. I mean, we hear a lot about Scottish barley, etc. And then you read this book, and a couple of things sprung up, which is the use of the Indian barley, or it was Indian barley in those days, purely for a filter bed, but Danish barley, Australian barley's coming in from left, right, and centre, and also some distilleries quite overtly saying we only use Scottish barley. So there seems to be a debate even in those days between what to use. That some distilleries going, we are only using Scottish, and others appearing to be taking barley from wherever. I mean, what's your take on that?
I take on that, Dave, is that sometimes we used to say predominantly Scottish barley. We might take some English barley, but you're right. I think one of the Glenlivet owners at the Royal Commission said that he tried Glenlivet to get Murray, Banff, Aberdeenshire barleys, but on a poor year, the barleys were behind. He might go to Denmark. Denmark produces lovely barley, still does, hence such a predominance of brewing in Denmark. I've seen Danube barleys. I've seen Californian barleys in the old records and a lot of the distilleries. Professor Weir wrote the Malt Distillers History a few years ago, and he, like Arthur, is borrowing stuff from McKinley's and Barney, where they kept meticulous grain books, and you can see it flexing up and down. He argues that after the First World War, you would be seeing lots of foreign barley because the world price had plummeted. Now, I've actually got the note of the first grains at Strathclyde Distillery, the first mash, and it's maize from South Africa or from Argentine, the plate estuary maize. The barley is commissioned malt, and it's from Karachi. The oats and rye, we assume, is Scottish, but even in the late 20s, they're still going abroad for it. Another quick thing, the old guys at Glenfarclas, when I went there, they said that they took lots of Australian barleys in the 1960s, but they said they loved it because it turned itself. It was lovely and dry barley, so it didn't need any drying, sun-kissed, but it turned itself, and that was the little weevils within the grain were making the grain jump. So they liked it. So you would take weevil infestation in. I think since the 60s, since the development of Golden Promise and grains, we probably use more and more Scottish grain. But I was looking at Professor Weir's stuff today, and he's in the 20s, 30s. Bumpshire still provide any barley grown, 84% is going for distilling, but there must be a shortage roundabout, because remember, a third of the farm would be given over for making oats for the men and the people and the horses. So a third of your farming area was done for that. So hence the advent of the tractor meant that they looked at other cereals.
Yeah.
No, I agree with Alan that when you think about it, the farms, a lot of the distilleries would have been in areas where they weren't maybe able to grow decent barley, and if they weren't able to take it from neighbouring counties or whatever, then maybe they had to look for the best supply. What does amaze me is that even nowadays, you're shipping barley from Algeria, from Australia, from India. You think it would be more expensive doing it that way than it would have been growing it locally. But even in my era when I was growing up, I wasn't aware of barley being grown in the area that I grew up. It was all corn, and there was no barley grown. So that those stooks that you showed earlier in the show, I'm not sure if they were barley stooks or corn stooks, but I'd never known barley to be grown in this locality. So maybe it was something to do with the type of soil, whether the farm maybe not big enough to justify growing a lot of barley. But it does surprise me that they were taking it in from abroad, especially as Alan said just a minute ago. Why would you take it from a boat from Australia? It must have taken how long? A few months?
Enough for weevils to be born.
Enough for weevils. Yeah, the weevils were multiplying as they came across the Pacific.
So you got plenty of husk shells to filter your mash through. The other book that I'm going to spend some time looking at is to compare Nettleton, because Nettleton gives you the more techie stuff, and he's speaking about a lot of Canadian barley coming in, and he's got the costs for it, and it is cheaper after shipment. So in a era when farming was like today, under a lot of pressures, they were under pressure from this grain coming from abroad, naturally dried, because you can see in some of the 1920s distilleries, they're beginning to put in kilns to dry the barley. The best example being the two twin at Imperial. So they must have been thinking of drying their barley, because George, the old colonel at Glenlivet, speaks about having to thin out the barley in the barley lofts. Now, we all know that damp malt can spoil quickly. I would imagine the germination capacity of the grains in those days would be very poor. So there's maybe a spot of that. Yeah. And I actually told an Indian distiller who was looking to make whiskey, I says, oh yes, we used to take barley from Karachi. He says, can't do that, it's from Pakistan now. And I thought, oh, okay.
You once saying to me, I think it was after the clearances episode that we did, with Canadian barley, and it was known as the Crofter's Revenge.
Yes, absolutely. Going over and getting a plantation of a set acres. Yeah, that was the revenge. They ruined the barley prices for them, for their own.
Yeah, I just kind of widening this. And sorry, Arthur, I know we want to move on to this. I'm intrigued by this. That part of this. I mean, just think about the answer that you gave, Alan and Bobby. That one thing is to do with transportation. The locale of the distillery. Even though we spent a lot of time looking at rail, etc., there were still a lot of pretty remote distilleries, so that could have a knock-on effect. And the second thing is you're seeing an increase in production, and Scotland simply not having sufficient barley to be able to provide for a growing industry. So there's a lot of things kind of underneath it.
Yeah, and what struck me about Glenvora as well, the story we tell ourselves, or you hear about Scotch whisky production up in Speyside, near that great barley from the Black Isle. This is Glenvore in Inverness. You would think it's in the heart of barley country, at least to the story I told myself. So I thought that was interesting. But also, to come back to Dr. Nick and Neil Mackenzie's point, who is the audience for the magazine? And it's clearly important to them to say, we use Scottish barley. I thought that was interesting. Whether or not they're telling the truth.
Of course, if you're in Forfarshire, down into Angus and that, and the Mearns and along Murray and that, there will be a bit of local barley going in. But remember, the whisky smugglers at Glenlivet were importing barley from the lowlands, which is Elgin, Murray, Hampshire, because they couldn't grow enough. They grow the old landrace barley beer, which can grow quick in the summer season, but not. I haven't found a mention of beer barley yet.
No.
But is that now seen as old-fashioned? Because in Barnard, Highland Park's exclusively beer. When Glenlivet bought the Cairngorm distillery, it's about the stacks of beer it's growing there. But now we're speaking, Highland Park speaking in this book, we take it from the Lothians, the breadbasket of Scotland sort of story.
But I suppose they used to get a rebate, didn't you, if you used the bare barley? That's long gone now, I suppose. You used to get a rebate because of its low output. That's long gone. So there's a drive towards efficiency of some type, and it's cheaper to bring it in.
Yeah.
But beer's making a comeback as a heritage barley. So it's amazing. Yes.
I was curious, chaps, how familiar the distilleries felt, or how different they felt to you when you looked at them. You're in and out of these places through long careers, more than I am, and recognise these places. Did they feel different? Did it depend on the distillery? Obviously, there's a lot that's changed, but were there elements that you found reassuringly similar, or was it starkly different? Robert?
Yeah, what I did notice is that some of the distilleries that I've been at have changed enormously since the time of the photographs in that book. I did find some of the photographs in the book may not have been from that era between 1922 and 29, and I think Nick Morgan, Dr. Nick, had said that in the previous show. But yeah, I was picking on the distillery, one of the distilleries in our group, mainly because it hasn't changed much between Glencadam. Yeah, there we go. So that picture on the left is Glencadam Stillhouse from the 1926, and so, and the one on the right was taken in about 10 days ago, and you can see albeit we don't have coal fires now, but if you look at the two stills, the spirit still, it was when Hiram Walker took over the company in 1955, they started to change the spirit still, but because in the 1920s, it says in the book that both stills were the same size, which is, I would imagine, quite unusual, because some of the other comments from the other stills was that the wash still was 5,000 gallons and the spirit still was 3,400 gallons. But at Glencadam, it says they're both the same. But if you were to walk into Glencadam today, you would see the stills still cut off at the same point because that floor is still there. You'll see the sample safe, which is on the left-hand side. It's in the same position, albeit it's a bit higher up now than it was then because we've added a bigger receiver. The bit on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a lattice work of a handrail. Well, that's still there, albeit it's metal going through to the mash house. And the one that's the only bit that's different is on the left-hand side, the lattice work handrail that you see. That was going to the. We think that was going to the maltings, but So very little, apart from the furnaces and been changed to steam. There's that picture, that view you get is very similar. Now, and again, we can, I don't know the rest of the distilleries, but there's very few distilleries that you can walk into nowadays that would be the same layout as 1922 to 29. And I can understand that a lot of companies have they've increased their capacities, and to do that, they've had to cannibalize the old buildings to put in new mash tuns or add number of washbacks and whatever. So I don't know of a lot of distilleries that would still look the same now as they did in the 1922 to 2029 era. I know, and again, Alan, he's latterly been the distiller at Glenlivet, but I remember at Glenlivet walking to school when I was 5 years old. You walked past the boiler house door. Inside the boiler, well, inside the big door was a big boiler with a mound of coal beside it. On the right-hand side, and this was something that I've noticed in quite a few of the pictures, there was a place called the Battery House, and so there's a lot of strange names in the distilleries, but this was a battery house, and all it was old switchgear. Now this was 1960 to 62, 63. So at that time, the Glenlivet one probably hadn't changed much between 1922 and 1960s. But now, and I'm sure, I don't know so much, has Aberlour changed a lot, Alan, or is it much the same as it was the layout in the 1920s?
Yeah, the Aberlour still, who's the stills in the leaflet are the same. They're exactly in the same place. And when Aberlour was expanded, they just put a mirror up the middle of the still house and copied a wash spirit. So that's the Aberlour wash and spirit, where the number one pair still exists. So the stills, a lot of the stills, Glenlivet, you've just shown, Arthur, the pinched waste spirit stills, it's like a holy grail. We won't change the capacity of them, but we can check through the records that you got to a certain shape round about the late Victorian era, and they wouldn't change it after that. That's probably back to the old Macallan story, is that the Macallan stills were kept small so they could fit onto the back of a Volkswagen transporter from the coppersmiths. But I don't know if that's an urban myth. But yeah, you can see the Aberlour stills. What they've lost is the rivets. The captain told, oh, that's a good one of Glenbergie, the number one pair, and that is the number one pair in the front of the new still. And again, the two pairs have been copied behind it. And in fact, the number one wash still at Bergie, which is in the left of the picture to the front, still has a direct fired pot still in the bottom, and Bergie was converted from coal in 1958. So that shows you how thick a still bottom it has, though the head has been replaced many times. So, but the shape hasn't changed.
Yeah, I'm just picking up on that one. When I was reading through the book, there was the occasional mention of old stills, as if there was an old shape, a modern still shape. I think it was more actually mention of the modern still shape rather than what's your thoughts on that? I mean, does this suggest that was it just capacity was increased, or was a new shape coming in, were boil bulbs coming in, or whatever?
Well, I noticed on the looking through them, there's a lot of stills, a lot of very big stills, which surprised me because I thought they'd be much smaller capacity. But I noticed a lot of the shape of the stills, and there was there was Aberlour, there was Glenmurray, Dufftown, Milton Duff, Highland Park, I think was another one, that they all had roughly the same shape, and they weren't of the pinched waist type. They were, they looked like a bit like like onions. You know, there wasn't a lot of shape to them. And so when I was looking through that, I thought, well, was that because a particular coppersmith? No, because were they so fascinated by the shape of the still, assisting the quality of the spirit? You know, the more contact with copper, the lighter the spirit. Was that what they were looking at? And I thought, well, it must be the copper works. And then when I tried to look for the coppersmiths, and I could only find 2 references to coppersmiths. There was Stewartson and Son and Willison, which I believe Willison was the pre-runner for Forsyth. There's no the authors didn't seem to home in on the copper pot stills. There's no great description about their shape or the boil. This one's got a boil ball and the other ones haven't. So and I know that speaking to Alan a couple of nights ago, we were going through the ones with the boil balls, and I imagine that some people thought boil balls were a sort of a new invention. But obviously, when you look at the number of stills with boil balls in the book, there is quite a few. But there's a lot of the stills, as I said, there was Aberlour, Glenmurray, Milton Duff. They all seem to be the same shape. Why? No idea. The other thing that surprised me was how big the stills were. I mean, we're talking some of them 5,000 gallons, and I can't remember. There's one. I can't remember what the biggest one was. Was that 8,000 gallons? That's a monster.
That's imperial. Yeah, the imperial pot. But I think that's a full capacity, Robert, not the operational capacity.
That's not really charge capacity.
No. Because the Glenlivets are put in quite high, but we only put 15,000 litres in them. Only it's still big in terms. The other one is that you are seeing in it. I think it's Towiemore and Stronachate have just put in new stills and they've made them larger. So that's probably an old way of expanding. I think when Longmorn was built, the Northern Scot was quite rude, saying that there's plenty of stills in Speyside, and many have been expanding and heightening their stills. So that evolution of the shape, the still coming in. Arthur showed the Cardew stills there, which when Cardew was redone in 1960s, it adopted onions, and you can see a ball pot there. And if you go back to the Glenfiddich picture, Arthur, is one of that stills one of the stills that came from Cardew? I don't know. Or is it an exact copy of the one that came from Cardew? And also, just to add it, but before the fire at Aberlour, they were all ball pots, and that got lost as well. But you can see an evolution in the shapes in the book. If you look at the Duluan imperial stills, there's a similarity in the book, but evolution has meant that they've got rounded. The coppersmiths put in more hammering into it, which is expensive. You start putting round things into it. If you can make it in straight lines, it's a lot cheaper.
That was something else. A lot of those stills had flanges on them. They weren't riveted.
Yeah, if they were coming up from Glasgow, I suppose, in the train, the easiest way to carry them up or something like that. Yeah, but then Forsyths used to put them in. We used to put them in, still do, and then hammer them back again, weld them, hammer them. So it's again cost.
Would any of this have had an effect on flavour? If even though you increase the size, still obviously it will, but if the ratio of liquid to still,
it's bound to have an effect, but the terms of the effect, Dave, is always fascinating to try and quantify. Yes, as Robert said, you're increasing the copper content if you're making them taller, bigger. But then that knowledge came from the lowlanders who were distilling rapidly. So how did they distill rapidly? They broadened the bottoms and heightened the heads. So that evolution came from there. But you do see mention that the stills get larger as going out.
I think also, again, my take on it would be: is it easier because these stills were coal-fired, so was it easier to control? I mean, you imagine that you've got when you're running a coal-fired still, you've got to think a good bit ahead, because you can't just switch off the coal immediately. So you've got to think ahead. When's the still going to come in? When's it going to when you're going to the spirit still? When you're going to go into spirit? You slow the feed down. And was it easier to control a big still than it was to control a very small still? So
come over as quickly.
And also with another thing I looked at in the stills is digressing slightly, but I only found one. I can't remember which distillery it was. And a wash still, they used to have the old wooden ball on the side for no, because they didn't have sight glasses on them. I only found one. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was the ball on the side, because there was and I think Alan, you mentioned a couple of nights ago.
I'll lend you my magnifying glass.
Is there more than one? Is there? I found one of the stills with a flue gate as well, but
I always tell visitors, if they want to see the wooden ball still in action, head up to Tomatin. They're still there.
Is that the origin of the term bull man?
No, the ball man is the man that operated the spirit safe, the beads, the hydrometers.
Yeah, okay.
But it could be, Arthur, you might be right. But
no, I doubt that
the ballman was considered higher paid. I think in Barnard you'll find it, in Dundas Hill it's there, and in the job adverts you'll find ballman. Yeah, interesting. It was the more skilled job. The other guy was throwing the coal in.
And just kind of flipping this round, old stills are mentioned a few times, and I think there's a couple of distilleries that really kind of leapt out at me reading this. One was Talisker, because you've got Talisker, the only, as far as I know, and Joe, I know you're lurking. As far as I know, this is the only Talisker being triple distilled, and very, very different setup to what it is now. And also Lefroy had a very peculiar still setup as well. There probably is a couple more. Pulteney was mentioned, and Stromness.
Yeah,
Stromness. Pulteney's got a huge boil ball.
I think the Stromness, Dave, probably answers that question in the old still. Because the two stills are on display outside the still house. It even mentions in the book that they're under the exciseman's gaze, and this is seemingly the still probably that Barnard referred to. But then you go inside the still house and you find the pinch waist, which is common to Glenlivet. But the Glenlivet shape is often copied around the world, as we know. You'll go to a lot of places and you'll see the pinch waist, and they obviously go to Richard Forsyth and he gives them the poster and he says, that's Glenlivet, Macallan, I'll have one of those and two of that. Or, I see a Lagavulin in there, I'll take one of those. So, but the mystery's a wee bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. The other mystery that cropped up for me, a couple of distilleries. One, there's no mention of the famed 2.81 distillation. In fact, there's no mention of partial triple distillation anywhere in the book. There's only one mention of triple distillation, and that's Talisker, which the book says is the only example in Scotland, which I find slightly questionable. Maybe.
Yes, because if we speak to Barnard, we see triple distillation. If we go through it, the records, we see multiple receivers, which is a fair example. But that's one of the still houses at Old Mortlake. I think they were put into one still house when it was rebuilt. But they faithfully kept all the type of distillation there. I see Alan Wolstenholme is, you're right, Arthur, it's Ballman's the man that hits the ball. So.
Yeah, I do win a book. Good, thank you.
But yes, interestingly, Talisca's got less stills now than it has. It's got less stills now than it has in the book. So the triple distillation, it went out in the 20s. I think that was after the Combine bought the distillery from Dillue and Talisker Distilleries.
And do you think it was the only, gentleman? Do you think it was the only one triple distillation?
Looking at Nettleton, I think we go to Nettleton, we see multiple distillation. Glengrant used, with the 4 stills, used to catch heads off the strong liquid went to a stronger receiver, though there was only 2 receivers, and then Geordie, the little one, was used as a neak still. You used to eke it to make strong feints, but then when the group was Seagram looked at the quality of the spirits, they liked the consistency of Glenlivet with the balanced distillation. So, that's a fascinating photo. Do you see the charcoal charger? Just at the back of the wash still.
Yeah. I don't. You asked me to put it up there, but because of the charcoal charger, and I still. What is the charcoal charger?
So we used to mix charcoal in with water and charge so much into mainly the big spirit still, because we took most of the spirit off it, and that was to help the clearing of the spirit.
And what am I looking at? Which part is the charcoal charger?
All right, you see the wooden vessel at the stillhouse wall.
Okay, yes, I'm with you now. Okay.
And it's between the 2 spirit stills, because the 2 wash stills on the outside. And also note 4 different shapes of stills in the Glengrant stillhouse. And Glengrant bought stills from Mortlach when Mortlach went to receivership just before the move to Glengrant. So did they take a shape like that from Mortlach? We don't know.
We see.
Aberlour, when they closed Aberlour and moved down.
Yeah, but one of the other issues, or topic issues, one of the topics I wanted to pick up on, it kind of inferred there in what you were saying about the charcoal charger, that I was really intrigued as to a lot of the energy saving technology that was underway. You know, my beloved Greens economizer, being one of them. But there was an awful lot. You know, we think of this as being very modern, about, you know, it's about sustainability and about, you know, lowering energy costs and, you know, fuel costs, etc., for environmental reasons. This might have been purely for financial reasons, but there does seem to be a huge amount of innovation going on in terms of trying to save energy. You've got distilleries moving to steam, and it's deliberately mentioned that distilleries moving to steam. You know, and reed beds, you know, for you know, treating for effluent as well. Things that are perhaps considered to be innovative now appear to be underway in the 1920s. I mean, what do you think of that? Was it surprising, or is this just something that, you know, you knew that we just haven't talked about?
I assume that, Alan, that the Greens economizer was the same as the Greens equipment they had in Glenlivet in the 70s. Well,
yes,
late 70s. Same company.
Yeah, I think it lasted right on to that. That's right.
They're an old. I knew they were an old company, but I thought it was the same. I thought it was the same company. But no, I agree with Dave that there's a lot of innovation in the industry. Again, I think it was Dr. Nick that mentioned about Peter Mackey. He seemed to be one of the biggest innovators in the industry. And if you're cutting to the back end of the process on the effluent treatment side, I think he was the one that was progressing the effluent treatment at where was it, at Craigellachie. And so the things that we are taking now that we think is modern issues, they were looking at them even back then. And I suppose, I mean, go back to Glencadam. What wasn't when we showed the photograph? That photograph was taken, I think, 1926. But Glencadam shut down for a short period in 1926. And the reason it shut down was the price of coal and overproduction. So fast forward to the 2020s, where energy, which that was my day job today, the energy issues that we're having with the price of gas and the price of oil, Glencadam shut down in 1926 because of the price of coal. So they were looking at they probably weren't run by accountants, but they were looking at the cost of production even in the 1920s. So anything that they could do would be beneficial to their bottom line.
Yeah, I noticed in some of the comments coming up the side, you have to remember we had the Royal Commission on Sewage in 1908 to 1909. It's a fantastic document. I recommend it thoroughly, but it's a disposal of distillery effluent. And the Green Brigade were the landed gentry coming to fish the Spey. The distilleries had increased in production, so there was more pollution. So the book refers to that quite a bit, and it's in recent memory. So yeah, let's come on down and see my Dortmund filter and the bioplant. It's returning into the river at Cragganmore and places like that. You're right, Mackey's were quite innovative as well. Also, another guys that were there. We go. That's the Towers.
That's the Craigellachie one. Yeah.
The Charlie, what was his name? Charlie was the tower man for years until it closed. The Coke Towers are low removal of. So if you get spent lees and steep water, it'll clarify it quite a bit. The big technology change that will come in the 60s is a result of increasing capacities. But you'll still see littered round Speyside, the old contact beds, which were probably designed by Doig. He seemed to make a lot of money in that. Mortlake. And I'm fascinated in Dufton because there's still about 3 exist, but they're always downstream of their own water supply. So they're not that worried about their neighbour, but they don't want to pollute the water coming into their own distillery. So there's a bit, I'm all right, Jack, I've sorted my problem out. But they did combine, in the combination of Rothes distillers quite a bit. There's a lot of mention of land irrigation. Glenlivet did it for a long time. Robert, do you still do that?
We still do that at Glencadam, not at Tom and Till wasn't invented in 1922, but we still spray to land under license, obviously at Glencadam. The other thing that and I was aware of, but didn't realise that so many distilleries did it, when obviously pot ale being the highest BOD of the effluent stream, then they were spraying the pot ale into the flues. And then I imagine once they've sprayed the pot ale into the flues, they would scrape it off as a solid and put it onto land. So
which is what the combination of Rothes did. It evaporated. I think at Parkmore and Benrinnes they allowed it to go on fire. So you can imagine the reek it's going out that chimney when it goes on fire. So Mrs. Winchester would be complaining about her washing that day.
On the subject of effluent, I suppose up in Speyside as well. I think you said something about it's within living memory. There was a big case, wasn't there, in the 1890s? Was it? I think it was Macallan. And that was very public, very well reported, and it was a kind of test case. And it was actually bought by some of the landowners who had leased the land out to distillers and then complained because they were concerned that the amount of salmon was declining. And I have saved off loads of documents. I think it was one of the possible shows we were going to talk about, actually, Dave. Yeah, we may come back to it. So I had the data saved. Here was a lovely one from September 1897 when they're discussing it. The alleged pollution of the River Spey by the refuse of the Speyside distillers has been agitated so greatly that the Speyside distillers have met in conference with a view to devise some satisfactory means of finally settling this vexed question. The present proposal is rather a gigantic one. It is a proposal to collect and run the whole of the waste matter from all of the distilleries on Speyside by means of a pipe into the sea.
Wow.
It's funny though, that idea gets floated every so often. Take the water out of the spey and everybody can tap off it for cooling. That ideas get generated that was the beauty of the malt distillers associations when they would get together to sort out a common problem. I think Colburn was the first distillery to put in the contact beds, and the Royal Commission speaks to that greatly about the work it's done. You know, as a test of quality, the distillery manager should always be able to drink the water coming out of his effluent plant.
Well, there you go.
That's what the when we were doing our effluent treatment course a long time ago, the guy from which was then the Northeast River Purification Board, when we did our course, they visited 10 distilleries, and he was always wanting us to drink the water from the final effluent, but he wouldn't do it himself until he went to one of them, which was Tormore, and he drank it, and I believe he's still alive. But going back to the effluent treatment and the filter beds, what we don't know is if the water coming from that was then discharged back into the river, at what consent level would it have been then compared to now? I mean, we've got 25 BOD in a good day, maximum 25 BOD discharged into the river. What would it have been in the 1920s? Would they get away with a much higher BOD?
No, I think the Royal Commission standard has lasted right through, Robert. I think it's about 2030 or something. Yeah, 20 BOD, 30 solids.
Well,
but if you're in the river, if you're in the spey, you can get higher dilution.
But putting it through that 4 filter beds at Craigellachie, obviously that 4 beds are worked in the same idea as the settlement of the beds are at the moment, the aerobic treatment side. But so that must have been going from one bed to the next to the next to the next to get purified.
But they used to change them over. The ones at Dillewin would be so many weeks, and then they would go to the polishing stage to allow the biomass to
build, which we do nowadays as well, some places.
But then again, what we were speaking about in Speyside now, with anaerobic digestion plants all round collecting, and it's something it was what was understood, and they took it from the Canadians, was to get the value out of the pot ale, because at Glenlivet they used to take the pot ale down to the farm and feed it through pipes as a drink for the cattle, the livestock. But there was so much volume of it. So as production goes up each time, so the effect's going to be there's not going to be much innovation over the next few years because the industry's pretty static, but it's when it grows again. And also at this time, we can't mash and distill at the same time. It's the 1823-24 Distilling Act. Mashing can't be concurrent with distilling. But funny enough, it was excise that introduced that, and a lot of the distillers were very conservative about doing that. So, there's a conservatism creeps in. That's why I think some distilleries, some owners won't change things.
Going back to Dave's comment about the efficiencies and the energy saving, a lot of the distilleries had draft dryers, which must have been very energy intensive. Probably used the waste heat from part of the process, but that must have been, and again, it posed the question. I mean, draft dryers nowadays are non-existent, obviously, in a distillery, but it posed the question: why did they dry their draft? Because wasn't there enough cattle locally to feed it wet? Because you weren't talking a large quantity. I think Arthur's going to show the slide later of the innovative draft. There we go. Draft apparatus, 1925. 2 guys and 2 shovels.
There's no sign of the cart.
No, I don't know where they were putting it.
Again,
Alan, I remember going back to that one. I remember you taking me down to Edradour in, was it 1992 or something? I can't remember when it was. We had to go to Edradour because Alan was itching to show me the draft removal system at Edradour, which I'd never seen. I'd never been to Edradour in my life. So we had to go on this day to watch this draft. So Alan timed it to perfection. Obviously, a Pernod-owned distillery at that time. So when we arrived there, we walked into the mash house, and here was the two guys, and it was a 1 ton mash, I think it was, Alan. Here's the two guys, one on either side of the rakes of the mash tun, opened up a window and a shovel each and shoveling the draft out of the window into the cart. And I'm thinking, this is the 1990s.
I think they've got a
having said
I think
that,
they were conveyor now.
And I couldn't have laughed, but I always thought it was a bit archaic until I went to Glencadam. I mean, Glencadam is still back in the 1920s, but when I went to Glencadam, they were still dropping their mash onto the ground. Okay, it wasn't two guys in a shovel that was lifting it up. It was a guy with a bendy tractor thing with a bucket that was loading it into the cart. And I'm thinking, God, this is very archaic. Well, that was 2003 that we took over Glencadam. It's only this year we managed to put in a draft conveying system. So we've gone away from the 1920s and the draft handling, and we're now a bit more modern.
Get it to 1950s at least. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But it does. I mean, just thinking about where that puts us and picking up on what the prof and the doc were saying early on. Here again is a good example of the industry on the cusp of change. And you know, it was just what you were saying there about the draft and why they need to try it. Well, in the old days, there would have been sufficient cattle or whatever around to be able to, you know, feed the draft straight into the cattle. But distillery location has changed. There's more urban distilling. Perhaps farming practices have changed. Distilleries have got bigger, and all of a sudden, you know, it's almost like the whiskey industry is trying to keep up with itself. You know, it's getting bigger, but there are a whole number of new solutions that it's got to take on board.
Also, draft that was dried would keep longer. So there were some in the book again. It's mentioned that they were putting the dried draft into bags. So obviously that would keep longer. But then was dried draft some sort of feed for anything other than cattle? You know, was it used for something totally different? That because wet draft obviously has got a very short shelf life, unless you put it into a pit and compress it, but keep the air out of it. But if there wasn't sufficient market for the wet draft from the locality, then because I mean draft was a great feed for milking cows, you know, for dairy cattle, and I would imagine there's a lot of dairy cattle kicking around in the 1920s. In fact, digressing again, some of the distilleries, you know, kept some. Because the distilleries in those times were all the workers were in the locality, you know, very local to the distillery, and some of them that were in the cottages, they actually had kept cows for the milk for the workers. So
can she read that about them?
I can't remember where. There's that many comments and photographs in this book, and it's a weighty tome. So I'm hoping that somebody in the background is going to take up photographs that are. You must have a hell of a stock of photographs there, Arthur.
The other one I was fascinated to see I'd heard about, and Brian Spiller speaks to it in his history of Cardew, is the oil and gas burners at Cardew Distillery. And yet Brian Spiller says the manager's writing Alexander Walker and saying the equivalent of 100 gallons of oil is 32 shillings and threepence, but the oil is 23 pence. No, 33 shillings for the oil, and the equivalent coal's 23 shillings. So the distillers are down to the pennies again. even in a large distillery, a grain distillery, big distilleries, you go to maybe 4 decimal points looking at savings. So that's enough to get them. So he keeps stealing. So they took it out. But then, 1950s, Mr. Hobbs is heating his stills with oil burners. You know, the story. They went off that, and a lot of them were channeled to steam after that because the oil corroded the stills. But Richard always tells a fascinating story that Mr. Hobbs was told that his stills were warm, and Richard says he took his father up to the laboratory and boiled water in a paper bag in the laboratory to show that's thin. But these stills will last a little bit longer. But the equation was the oil was cheaper than the coal. The wear of the stills would be offset in the savings he made. So that sort of thing. And you see it here. And I was always brought up to think that the 20s, 30s was decline. They weren't doing anything, but they were trying to save a penny here and there. So I think that's a fascinating enlightenment. And also the book takes to me one of the reasons, and we see it in some of Professor Weir's writings, that the yields went up in the 20s, 30s. And I'm going to throw in, I think that's the 4 roller mills being taken into the industry, because I thought that was later, because we know of these mills going in. I think Highland Park was the first, Cornwall Moor after the fire, but we get notes that they're just being put in. Glenlivet has got a Bowbie mill, and there's the Glenlivet Bowbie from the 1920s, a Bowbie mill. Now look at the health and safety at that. That's a big change. The belts are all, the moving parts are available. So that wouldn't meet the latest standards in a distillery. And you will see lots of that throughout the distilleries. And you understand now why there was quite serious accidents with the cogs in the top of the mash tun, folk getting trapped with things like that. So there was a bit of health and safety needed even in that era.
It's interesting that we mentioned about the innovations in the environment, but health and safety didn't seem to be. There's one picture, I think it's from an Irish distillery. I think it's at Cumber Distillery. The guy's in the middle. I mean, there's so many cogs and pulleys and whatever all round about them. And going back to what you were saying there about the mill, the Dalmore mill, because the Porteous mills that we're in, there's pictures of Porteous mills in the book. If you didn't know it was from 1926, you would say they were from yesterday. But when you look at the Dalmore mill, which wasn't a Porteous, obviously, I think, if I'm correct, was that a 2-roll mill, the Dalmore one, Alan?
Yeah, it's a picture of a 2-roller, or what we would call a bruiser. And
when you see the belts at it, I think the Dalmore pictures are from pre-1920s, but interesting for the Dalmore one, the Dalmore booklet starts off, the company booklet starts off by saying it's as per Barnard. Well, I thought the Dalmore book came out about 1920, and Barnard had been dead for 2 years by that time, so it wasn't him it was visiting. But in fact, I've got it. I have it here somewhere. But yeah, the mill at Dalmore. I mean, it was just health and safety would have been a nightmare. And the other one I was commenting in the book. There's a lot of places. I mean, the water wheels were predominant, obviously, and the water wheels moved the pulleys and the cogs and the belts and whatever. Well, there's a lot of them where you can see the belt is slack. So somebody must have had to go and put that belt onto the pulley. Imagine the accidents that would have happened with that. And then you go to the mash tun at Dallas Dew. They've got a huge pulley at the end of their mashing machine, but there's no belt on it. So again, somebody must have to go and force that belt onto the. Yeah, if you look on the left there of the Dallas Dew mash tun. In fact, that I was saying to Arthur earlier, when I got this book, first page it opened up was Dallas Dew. And as I said earlier, when you're looking behind the photographs, that was, I mean, I spent a lot of time just looking at that, not that one, but the one with the mash tun. And when you look at it, a lot of on the mashing machine, the valves, I remember that valves and tun room when I was starting my career in the 1970s. Same type of valve. And also the mash tun must have been quite small. I don't know. Does it look like a 2.5, maybe 3 ton mash? But the thing that intrigued me about that one was there's a wee door on the side. And obviously that was the door, and there's a hook above it. So they lifted up that door. 2 guys must have jumped in the mash tun through those steps and shoveled the draft out the door into probably a barrow, and then they took it away for as a wet feed. So, I mean, just looking behind it, 2 aspects of health and safety was putting that belt onto that pulley, and also the guys jumping in to the mash tun to shovel all the draft out.
Arthur got discovered a remarkable piece of film, which I don't think he's got lined up for. I didn't mention it, of the clearing out of mash tun in an Irish distillery.
Kiev, yeah.
Well worth seeing. It's quite alarming towards the end as the heat begins to build, and the guys clearing out the mash tun decide to divest themselves of their clothing.
Something else we should maybe mention that for the health and safety aspect, a lot of these guys, when they were shoveling the draft out of the mash tun, or they were doing all the dirty jobs, they probably had about a half pint of cleric in their system.
They got it after they emptied the mash tun.
Well, maybe some wouldn't have come out their bed at 3 a.m. That was another thing. I remember some of and again, this is in the 1960s. Some of the guys used to come out at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning to pump the draft. I can only quote. I mean, I grew up in Glenlivet, and I used to go there as a kid. But and again, Alan, you can recount the years, but they used to slurry the draft and pump it up into a big hopper above the mash tun.
There's quite a bit of mention of that in the book, actually, and I see a lot in the Campbellton distilleries where there's mention of a number 2 mash tun, but you can still see it at Springbank. They slurry it, and the reason being, Robert, is they were throwing the grains on the floor, so that's manual handling. They're slurrying it, pumping it up to I think they called it either mash tun 2 or the drainage tank, and they drained the sparge back while they started mashing. And because the Glenlivet original tun sat on the floor, and you see that in Campbellton, but that's probably the tightness of space. So can you decouple some of these operations to speed things up? And it's a bit like, we actually looked at it. Is that a way of speeding up our processes? Take the sparge out of the mash tun, but there seems to be the tendency to look at taking the mashing stage out. So mash in, use the mash tun to filter, get all the dead time out. So that's it. But there's quite a bit in there, because I noticed Imperial is number 2 mash tun, but it's dropping it. It's dropping it down or dropping it up to drain it well, and then you'd put the cart in or the railway to drop it down. There we go, Draftcaster, Alan Wilson home.
You mentioned Glenlivet there, Robert. I'm not sure if you saw the last chat we had, but there was that lovely image of the steam wagons from the.
Oh yeah.
And then this one that's floated around the internet a little bit with the steam wagons on the road. And
I've never seen the first one before.
This one?
Yeah, I've never seen that one before.
That's the one in the book, Robert.
In the book, yeah, but I hadn't seen it before. It was in the book.
Had you seen that one? Because I heard tell that an ancestor of yours might have been one of the drivers. No.
Yeah, well, yeah. trying to prove it. We've got my family, the Fleming side of the family. My grandfather, he had a bit of a checkered history, but he worked at Glenlivet pre-1910, but then he disappeared for 10 years. He was actually in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War, but he came back in 1920 to the distillery. But during that period, my granny's side of the family, the Christies, they were also at the distillery. And then one of the Christies' predecessors was Stuarts, and they were at the distillery as well. But there's a comment, I just found it quite recently, because Alan mentioned to me once, our family never really discussed, who all worked and who did it, what at the distillery. Never really came up in conversation. But one of my relatives, when I was very young, had said that my grandfather was engine driver and then a cooper. And there is reference in our family, the wedding certificates and birth certificates and whatever, that when they mention about who the mother and father was, etc., and their occupation. And one of them on the Christie side says engine driver, and the one on the Fleming side says cooper. Now, I know there are photographs at Glenlivet of my grandfather, but I can't actually figure out which ones are the Christies. So I'm hoping that Alan's left now. I was hoping to get into the Chivas archive. I don't know how difficult it is to get into these archives, but I'm hoping. I wish I'd contacted Alan before he retired, that I would get access to the archive. Even looking at simple things like time books, because every distillery had a time book religiously, entered by quill and ink, and I would just love to find out. And then I know that going by the paperwork that I have, one of them was a cooper and one was an engine driver. But I cannot. That photograph of the three guys.
The four
One of them's
lorry.
not my grandfather. I know
The
that.
four lorry drivers in 1924, which is just a year after, is Jimmy Milne, Pat Keenan, Sandy Reid, and Bob Lobin. And where is he? Christie, Cooperage, Arthur Cooperage.
Arthur Christie. They called him Bisley.
Yeah. The lorry number plate should be my personalised number in my car. I notice it's AW. And I looked it up last night when Ian was and they were speaking about it, and that is registered to Salop. So is that buying equipment after the war? But the other lorry is registered in Banffshire. So quite interesting.
Yeah, SE's a Banffshire registration.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
As I say, I was only going by the family documents that as to who they were. But when you mentioned, there's Alan mentioned. I mean, some of the names you mentioned there, Pat Keenan. Okay, the 1921 census is not out yet, but the 1901, 1911, it actually determines the houses, the properties that George and J.G. Smith had, and also who stayed in them. And they had a lot of property. I mean, where I'm sitting at the moment, there's 3 houses just next to me. They were all distillery houses. In fact, my dad was born in one of them. But so it was, and families at the distillery. I know, Alan, you mentioned before about to me once before all the different people that some of your relatives and whatever, all different distilleries. But when I was growing up, we didn't travel far. But when I was growing up, the families that were at Glenlivet and some at Cragganmore and the local distilleries were all related to each other. So there was the Lawsons. They were a big family in the area, and then you had somebody Alan will remember, you had the McKillops. Neil McKillop was at Longmont at Benriach. So, and they had a long history up here as well. So there's a lot of families actually worked, and sons of families worked at the distilleries.
Also helped that Glenlivet's a long continuous history. So there was periods of layoffs and stepping up in production. Looking at 1925 production, it was actually quite 1923-24. It was quite healthy, but it kind of plummeted after that as we go further into the 30s. So at one point, it appears the captain offered the distillery to Highland Distillers at one point. So, Glenlivet had it tough as well. Most of my relations, the distilleries either closed or were paid off. Glencorder, there was ones on both sides worked at Glencorder. Alexander Green, the first manager, who died quite young, he'd been at Talisker, but he was actually, his family came from Auchtertool and Kirkcaldy. So they went down there. I think they went from Benrinnes. And then, of course, there's connections with Uncle, I think it's John Stewart. He was at Cragganmore, went to Clydesdale, worked with Colin Scott's grandfather at Clydesdale. They both went their own ways when it was closed by SMD, and he ended up at Ballychan and then Glenlochy. But judging by the book, he only saw about 2 years production in his 10 years there. But he made a lot of money off the stock and whiskey. He bought stock. So he must have been involved with Hobbs at some point.
You also found that there's a lot of the, not so much what you'd call the employees, but a lot of the brewers and managers. One of the Glenlivet guys went down to Glencadam. And they seemed to, I don't know if it was because that the Glenlivet area was synonymous with the quality aspect of the spirit, but they seemed to be the managers seemed to be would it be the 1920s equivalent of being headhunted to go down down to some other distilleries. So I'm sure they moved about quite a bit.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see that. The continual mention of the manager is coming from the North Country or coming from Speyside or whatever. It's repeated time and time again. And
the management move around. They've moved it. I mean, over the last 20 years, management have moved around. That's not usually. That's usually companies sending them out to the other locations.
We were a chivas. We used to put our wallpaper on with drawing pins because we'd be shifted so often.
Before I moved to Tomintown, my daughter said to me, when I was sitting at Christmas dinner, she says, "Where will I be next year, Dad?" I'd 3 different houses in 3 years. I'd moved. So my shortest tenure was 4 weeks at Altavane.
It was good for training. Yeah. But that's an interesting story, though, Dave. Was there a cross-fertilisation of ideas being trailed from one area to the other? We speak about Hasty. Nick, in his book, speaks about Hasty, of course, Hazelburn, the laboratory. Alan Wilson, who has connections with. Alan told me that his grandfather had worked in a laboratory at Yoker, and there's quite a bit of laboratories when you go. That's one of our old colleagues there. He's sunning himself in the Cognac region just now, so yeah. He'll be drinking 18-year-old Glenlivet, knowing Bill, though. But that's a sort of. I often wonder about that cross-fertilisation, and also these salesmen from Bowby and Porteous. They were selling these mills to all the breweries in Britain. Were they taking these? Was this cross-fertilisation? Yeah, that's the one I was speaking about. I got that from Ron Lee, who does the service in the mills. And there's James Grant's at Highland Park. James Grant's father or grandfather was a brewer at Glenlivet Distillery, which was across the water. He came from there. The houses all used to be named after glens, but they're all changed now. But you can see Annandale's getting one, and there's old James Eadie, got 2 mills. So, and James Eadie's estate was at Glenrinnes. So all these ideas going back and forth. So that was quite interesting. There's the Buchanan again, innovation. What I was looking on the book for was mention of the continuous experiments at Glentochers, Lochruin and Cornwall, but there wasn't any mentions of that.
I went straight to Cornwall Moor and went, yes, we've got it.
But the drawing sits down in the Charles Doig advert. That's Glentochers, double kiln. There's one with 2 furnaces. I think the furnaces may still be there. Quite an innovative distillery. And one distillery has allowed me to recalibrate, because when I went to Glentochers in 2005, they said that's a drum house. And I said, oh, is there a drum? Oh, yeah, there's a drum Malton in there. I assumed it was a drum Malton, went in and looked. Yeah, that looks like a steep. But this book tells us it's a sweating drum, and that was a new one to me for drying the grain. And this is us back to drying the grain. This is probably to store more in the lofts, and that was a recalibration. And it's a fascinating piece of equipment. Of course, it couldn't be run now because it would need a lot of health and safety for all the belts, but it was perfectly preserved. And I don't know when it went out of action, whether it went out of action in 1968. So there's little nuggets like that. You say that is challenging my perception. And the pickup of the mills. I love the mills, because the mills are always dismissed, but I think so much of the quality comes from that part of the operation.
And there is a couple of mentions there, Alan, in the book about how a Bobby mill has just been installed, and the old millstones have just been taken out. So a lot of these distilleries are still using very early 19th century, technology.
Yeah, that's right. The grain distilleries used it because the cereals were so hard, but then. And grain distilleries are fascinating. Where you catch the grain distilleries, they are in cusp of big training. Alan Wolstenholme would tell you that the processes are getting to incrementally change over the decades. They're not going to use mash tuns, they're going to use conversion vessels, they're going to do ingrains or not. And to such a point that the grain distilleries in Scotland are all quite different.
Yeah.
They don't really copy each other.
I was fascinated by the grain distilleries, but by the mash bills as well.
Yes.
There you have the evidence. The oats were being used. And just the scale of them as well, and pressure cooking, Strathclyde, which is I think quite a remarkable distillery and a remarkable entry in the whole book. A really modern distillery. You can identify that as an absolutely modern distillery. And from a historical point of view, you look at it and you look into Weir's book about DPL, and there are questions by the 1930s as to whether pot still distillation can even survive. And you with that in mind, you then look at the way in which the grain distilleries are being set up. You look at the scale of them, and you think, I'm not surprised that was the thinking, because these are forging ahead in terms of methods of production.
But yet again, no pictures of column stills, no discussion of column stills, just like they don't really talk about the shape of pot stills. I just found that curious, given that presumably it's the most expensive item of equipment in the whole distillery. Yet it doesn't get a mention.
Yeah, it's very rare to see a picture of an old column still.
It's quite hard to take a picture.
Because it was so much hidden through the floors in some of these distilleries. But Strathclyde actually had a Dansky still when it started, and put in a Blair's Cora Pine coffee from Blair's.
Right.
10 years later, because it corroded. But that's a good thing. There's good copper contact.
And Greg, great to see Greg. I'll see you in Paris in a couple of weeks. Yes, it did say oats. So yeah, oats were used as part of that mash bill.
Yes, oats and rye.
Maybe 3 and rye, 2 or 3 references to it. So for me, this book is about taking some of these assumptions that we've had about what this golden age, alleged golden age of Scotch whisky was, and it was all, it was all brewer's yeast, it was always worm tubs, it was always direct fire, it was blah, 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 blah. And you read this and you go, no, it was there, but there was an awful lot of other stuff going on. There's not an awful lot of other stuff that you would recognize today.
And even in the 1920s, you thought that everybody had worm tubs, but then you look in the book and you see, oh, there's condensers.
Yeah.
So condensers were around in the 1920s, and then you go to Dalmore, and you've got, there's 2 of them. I can't remember the second one, but you've got the pipes coming out of the still house and going into the lade or into the stream, albeit reducing diameter of pipe. So they were using the running water to cool the spirit.
Yeah, I suppose for me, it's this idea, which is a kind of a romantic idea that the whiskey is fixed. The dents in the still, that everything is how it has always been and it will never change. And this book just kind of goes, nah. It's in a constant state of movement and innovation and adapting to technology and economic climates, etc., etc. Nothing is staying still.
They always
one of the
are.
other things that fascinated me was there wasn't a mention of the spirit quality in the books, but then you get something like malt mill and Lagavulin that added heather to the mash to improve the bouquet of the whiskey. So it must have been a real crap spirit they were producing, and they decided to add an additive to the mash.
That's interesting, because they even put in burning braziers for a few hours to dry the wash. But going to Richard Patterson's book with the distillery, Richard, and goodness knows, gave us maybe Ballantyne's, maybe Daju's blenders list, and malt mill's rated high, but it's rated high for blending.
That's that must have been the heather that they were throwing into the mash tun to.
It's a curious mystery. I've forgotten this. We spoke about this when we first saw the PDF of it come through, Dave, those months ago, the full one, speaks to the idea of the metaphysical concept of what is a distillery, because Lagavulin is number 11. They talk about Lagavulin and malt mill, but then malt mill doesn't get its own number, and it jumps on to 13, which is then Booth's. Am I right? Yeah. So it's almost like they hedged their bets. Is malt mill its own distillery, given that they carry mash tuns or washback? So does it get its own number? It's almost like that quandary the Scotch Malt Whisky Society felt with, how they number various distilleries, different spirits or different distilleries. And they kind of hedged their bets with malt mill and Lagavulin.
Yeah. Apart from it, I think they're quite clear that they picked that up that they're very clearly Lagavulin is, in its term, a modern distillery, and malt mill is deliberately being kept as the old way of making whiskey. And that for me was fascinating. That was kind of
own number though, Dave. It doesn't get its own number.
Oh, you're a hard man.
I think Grant Carmichael quoted how much peat was burnt on the kiln, and it's a phenomenal amount of malt for a kiln. There's a lot of peat for the malt, which is a really old figure. But then the peats were slightly differently used, probably then, but they were still making it up into the 1960s.
There was an awful lot of peat being used across the board. The the Speyside mix was peat and coke. Cardew is mentioned in the book as having being particularly highly peated, but I can't think of many distilleries in that book where peat isn't used. So that, in terms of flavour, is also kind of pushing things in a slightly different direction.
So you're going to find also if most of the distilleries were using, I would imagine the peat was in different peating levels, but it shows that the quality of the spirit, or the type of spirit, maybe not the quality, but the type of spirit produced then is vastly different to what's produced today.
What do you think that spirit would have tasted like?
Sorry?
What do you think the spirit would have tasted like?
Unfortunately, I've never tasted spirit from the 1920s. Maybe you guys have been lucky enough to find some, but I would imagine that, again, going back to the peating levels, would the distilleries have made different types of spirit during the season to satisfy? Because I mean, peating's not an exact science, so they probably would have inadvertently made different qualities and types of spirit. But did they go out and they say, right, this batch is going to be non-peated, this batch is going to be peated? Having said that, maybe they were frightened to do it, because if all their spirit was going for blending, they didn't want the blenders to not take their spirit. But the quality would have been very different to what to what it is today.
Yeah.
The peats in Speyside have the less phenol, and then they had 2 to 3 years stock of peats, so the peats were very dry. So, and then of course, there you go. That's them cutting the famous.
If the peats were dry, then they weren't getting the same peat smoke going into because if the peats are dry, then they're just giving off heat. They're not giving off the smoke.
So the character could be lesser. Lesser than we think it is, because the one was when Gordon MacPhail bottled the 70, well, it's now the 80-year-old, we were looking for peat in it, because it was Glenlivet, it was leading into the war, and there wasn't a lot of peat. Now, I know the age has probably got rid of it, but we expected something peatier. So there's that. I don't know either, I'm the same as Rob, I haven't tasted much about it, but I always say that the blenders would have had an influence to the folks supplying them fill-ins to such an extent, and also the importance of the companies are getting big, with half the amount of single ownerships in the 10 years at these articles. So it's consolidating. So as the customers asking for more style of spirit. They certainly did in the 60s, because peat went flying out at that time for the American market.
And there were, because essentially it's the rise. We're talking about the rise of DCL, in the grand merger.
The other one I was looking for was Barnard spoke a lot about peats from Eadie. There's no mention of Eadie peat. It appears, it doesn't say it, but Milton Duff's not on Orkney peat, and there's no mention of the triple distillation as we've been speaking about, because Barnard speaks about that. The stories went in the cusp of the First World War.
So, in conclusion, guys, what surprised you the most about the book?
Well, for me, it was the photographs. Unfortunately, Barnard didn't have photographs, but this was the introduction of the photographs, albeit some of them probably weren't from the same. Some of them were pre-1922 probably, but no, it was the photographs were the. And the other thing that did, and again, it was after I spoke to Alan a few nights ago, that I was intrigued with the fact that, okay, everything's in proof gallon. Well, they mentioned gallons, which we assume is proof gallons. And I thought, okay, and going back to the quality aspect, nowadays we've got standard operating procedures and we've got God knows what all, but we were looking at, there's the slide that's up now. So I was fascinated just over the last couple of nights about everything was in proof gallons, and then I knew that from talking to Alan that Leon had done a lot of work on it. And I thought, well, okay, nowadays 415, 420 litres of alcohol per tonne would be something to strive for. But what was the yield in the 1920s? And looking at I hadn't seen this graph until tonight, but looking at the proof gallons produced and the bushels mashed and etc., that it appeared to be round about the 2.5 proof gallons per bushel, which, and again, Alan, if you've got your calculator handy, is that about what, 340-ish?
It's in the low 300s, yeah.
So litres of alcohol per tonne. Now I thought, oh, that's poor. I'd get fired for that. But when you think about it, they had floor malting, so probably not as efficient. Apart from one or two distilleries that had laboratories for testing their wash and whatever. So the mash tuns were probably not as efficient. The barley agronomy wouldn't have been the quality it is nowadays. So maybe in those days, 340 litres of alcohol per tonne or 2.5 proof gallons per bushel would have been excellent. But again, I've got no background to know if that was good or bad. But looking, and from Arthur showed me that graph tonight, when you look at it, there's a couple of anomalies in there, but when you look at the graph, that would be about the right figure to go to. Some distilleries obviously less than others, but the thing was that it doesn't always. It always says some says proof gallons, some says gallons. I'm assuming that when they mean gallons, they mean proof gallon. That's my assumption in that. The other thing, and again, just for my final thought on it, was from the 1820s to the 1920s. I mean, 1820s, you were carrying the malt in your shoulder in bags. You were there was no electricity, so basically all you used was water and fire. Water wheels for moving all the cogs and whatever. And then, so between 1820s, 1920s, you had this other industrial revolution. So the distilleries were taking the new a lot of mention of King's patent for the kilns. And then from the 1920s to the 2020s, you have a huge, step change. You've got nowadays. Alan can sit there and run his distilleries on his iPhone. So, well, maybe not into the if you come to Glencadden, we can't do that. But the thing that got me intrigued was 1820 to 1920, big step. 1920 to 2020, big step. What's it going to be like in the next 100 years? What is going to be, the big step change that somebody's going to look back on this YouTube video of four old guys. Sorry, Arthur. four old guys chewing over a book from 100 years ago. Just imagine what somebody's going to be like chewing over some standard operating procedures from distilleries in the 2020s.
I'll probably be operating the Mars hyphenated Glenlivet distillery then.
Elon Musk will have a distillery in the space.
One of the best surprises, probably not a surprise, but the thrill was to see inside Parkmore, Towiemore, and Glencorda. Glencorda because of the family connections. Parkmore because it's just a mile. It's half a mile from the house. To see the stills there, built by a guy who was connected to Glenlivet and was a brother of George Smith. But he was using all the latest ideas. He's using some recycle back from the top of the stills. You can see the recycle coming off the worm and the stills. Towiemore, because I was always told the story, it was a big, capable distillery. There's that story that Brian Townsend says it went cloudy when they put water in it. That might be something to do with the water supply. But a big, able distillery, but was kept as reserve by Adagio because the malting capacity was used for the nearby distilleries. Alan was speaking about Cragganmore not having enough capacity. That's mentioned in the book. So they must have been getting malt from sales maltsters or other sites. But the equipment, I was told, went to onto the train to replace Dalwhinnie when it was burnt down in the 30s. Now, the equipment, the stills had just been replaced, so they've been sitting as pretty good stills. So is there a bit of Towiemore up at thing? Glencorda, the great shame of it is it disappeared almost immediately up when it was closed. And you can go and look at it now and it's a green field. It's a park in the side of Nairn. And why it was out, but I refer you back to Richard Patterson's blenders lists. That might be one of the reasons. The concentration into high quality distilleries. I don't know. It's just a guess. But I still think the power of the blender was increasing. So they might have had a factor on it. Maybe that's why Glassic was shut for so long.
Arthur.
What?
I'm just thinking, given this is, we're not doing the writer's one, and this is us drawing to the conclusion of our analysis of the book. I mean, what surprised you the most about it? And what distilleries are you now intrigued by or falling in love with?
I think it was just the overall impact of it, to get a slice of time, and it's the photographs simply for me. I think in the first episode we were talking about it, I did a degree in archaeology, and it just reminded me of that time they cut Uzi the Iceman out of that glacier on the Austrian-Italian border, and suddenly we're seeing all the skin and the guts and the hair of the distillery. That's my summing up of this. And I found all the interpretation really fascinating, really interesting. But the photographs, you're just peering inside it. And the beauty of many of them, it's a really beautiful, beautiful pictures. The barley, that really struck me, just the sheer beauty of that. And this kind of lost world feeling that I just really, really appreciated. I don't know if a single distillery grabbed me. I know when we were teasing it out, and there were a few people, Johnny McMillan at Berry Brothers, he was asking for what's the thing, what's the big revelation, because he hadn't seen the book yet. And I think when he looked at the book, he was like, okay, tell me what we've learned. And there's no huge revelation. It's not like it's totally ripping up the copybook of what we thought about the past. It's just, you kind of realize that people were making it up a little bit. Maybe not you guys. I mean, I know, Alan, you've done a lot of work on this, but you do realize how much people were projecting their view of what they wanted whiskey to be onto the past with actually very little evidence. And this book gives some evidence, but also a hell of a load of questions and loads of little avenues that we can all scurry off down now, which is great and great fun. You just feel this opening up of new little corridors to have a look at.
And Dave, you as an author, I mean, you must have been trawling through archives for I was going to say decades, but years. But for this to come out, okay, it was in the National Archive. How much is out there that has yet to be discovered?
Well, yeah, there's a huge amount. I've got immense respect for archivists, and I now have a greater understanding of the frustration that archivists have when people such as authors or perhaps marketing departments come in and ignore the evidence the archivists have actually got sitting there in front of them. I mean, and this book, I mean, I couldn't put it any better than Arthur has just said. This book just opens up possibilities, new avenues to explore, and I think that is what excites me the most about it. You know, some assumptions I've had about whiskey are perhaps backed up. Other assumptions I've had about whiskey have been blown out of the water by it, which is great because, like I said earlier, nothing is fixed in whiskey, and the whole point about history, whether it's historians or whether it's antiquarians, is challenging the assumptions that this is true, and trying to find if there is in fact another story, another way of explaining it, and another layer that lies underneath it. Yeah, and the thing I took away with most is this idea, and it's never really mentioned overtly, but this idea of people working incredibly hard trying to make really great whiskey at a time when it was getting increasingly tough to do so because of economics and politics, etc., etc. And there's a palpable sense, I think, in the book, even though they're written as advertorials, that there is a desire on the part of people who are making own distilleries or owning distilleries and trying to sell it, that they believe in this. And I think that's what carried Scotch whisky through those really, really difficult years that were about to happen in the beginning of the 1930s. And that's kind of what I'm taking away from it, the stuff that lurks between the lines.
And Robert, you say how much more is there to find. I believe there is a lot more. Like, I've started looking places and I'm finding things. And Dave, we've got an episode that we've been working on for 6 months, 9 months. And it was always the book was just about to happen. And then this other big thing was just about to happen. And they've both been chasing each other down the road. It's more than 9 months, isn't it? And they were all, and at every given time, they were both going to happen in the same month or the same week. I think it might be end of September it's ready, if not early October, and could be the second biggest thing to happen recently in whiskey history, or it could be nothing. But I think it's big.
So you're going to send another copy out?
No. This, I mean, we're not going to reveal too much about what we're up to. But we're beginning to tread into your territory, guys. So beware. This is really, really, for us, really, really exciting. Practical application of antiquarian studies.
Yeah. So, we need to know, Dave?
I think we can take from that, Alan. They're going to buy an old distillery, put in a Bobby mill, belt-driven Bobby mill, coal-fired stills.
Yeah.
Something like that.
And a greens economizer just for.
Oh, yeah.
3 greens economizers.
3 greens economizers.
You have to. Yeah, sustainability, man.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been an absolute treat. Absolute treat. It's great to see you. And the depth of your knowledge is quite astonishing. So thanks so much for coming on board tonight to share just a small amount of what you know about whiskey making.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's very kind of you, but it's been fascinating to be invited to speak about this and also to see the book, etc. I think you've all congratulated Leon and Patrick for taking this. I know the hard journey that they took, but it's fascinating to see. Now, there are snippets have been mentioned before, but here it is. My goodness, we could pore over it for a while and look at it. and find something
That's it.
new.
As I said
We
earlier,
found the soapbox tonight. I had been looking for the soapbox, but that was fantastic.
I took it
I
with
do
me to
have-
Ireland.
I prepped the
Luckily, I
slide.
wasn't going.
Yeah, there's a soapbox. I was
There's a
looking for
soapbox.
it.
I was waiting for you to mention it. I'm glad it didn't go to waste.
There you go. Look at it on the right-hand side. A soapbox. Yeah, good.
And where's the one with the ball? Is there must be one with a ball somewhere.
There's one on that. I think there's one on
And
that.
there's one on the right hand
Glenronic.
side of that still, I think.
Glenronic.
Yeah,
This
You
one?
see the balls right at the
right
just
on the right hand side.
half up the pot. Yeah.
And yeah, and actually, before we go, neither of the questions have been answered. Therefore, there's still books available. 2 books which will now be going.
Oh right. I think it's screens round that washbox. They put screens round them.
I think Alan
And they
Wilson
hung
had
it
an
off.
earlier
Hung
comment
off
as
the
well about it.
screens. Yeah. Because
Um,
I'll tell you who had great ideas in fermentation was the guy, was it Bushmills that started up Glenkeith? Forgotten his name. He was a legendary character, and he used to throw the washbacks up when they stopped switching. This was the old manager told me this, because he wanted the wild yeasts to get in behind the froth and
Interesting.
make the character. And he learned the experiments that Dallas do, where they put Hessian sacks and wetted the windows so that nothing could get in. So I think your screens has something to do with that. I might be wrong. I was wrong about the ball one, you see.
well, there's a comment somewhere from Alan, but I can't.
I think there's one from Ian Russell, but I believe. Oh no, I do believe Ian Russell quite often.
So Alan says garden hoses to cool the washbacks in summer.
Yes, I do that at Strathclyde
But-
sometimes.
I don't think that was what was sitting on top of the washbacks.
Hasty speaks about cooling the yeast in the barrels.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we will go through and we will find 2 answers, and books will be winging their way to people.
Good.
Well, I think there's no clear winner.
Yeah.
I think that hang on, there's one man who deserves more than anyone a book, and he also asked a question. Mr. James Brown, Jim Brown.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a very regular, silent contributor to the Liquid Antiquarian. And let's just quit, Alan. I know you know the answer to this, and I think the default winner is Jim and Linda Brown of one of the books.
Absolutely. Well done.
Why did the Distilleries obtain lime? What was it used for, Alan? Alan, what's the answer to that question?
What's that? The lime?
Yeah.
Oh, the lime shells. Was that the? Yeah. The lime is mixed up to wash the washbacks. You'll see in the book some of the washbacks are lime. They're white on it. They used to sign their initials in the bottom. It had gone by the time I came to the industry, but at Glenkeith, they still had the stalagmites at the bottom of the washback where they cleaned them out. I don't know why, but you notice that a lot of the distilleries weren't whitewashed in those days. You know, Dalwhinnie's not whitewashed in the book. They started whitewashing everything, so they painted the outside and the inside of the distillery. There might have been a requirement under the Factory Act to clean the walls inside, because firemen had it as well and factories had it. So
They might have used the lime for neutralising the waste stream.
the pH of the effluent,
Take
yes,
a pH
neutralising.
down to a neutral pH.
I saw somebody answered that, yeah. But that's, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, 2 congratulations, Dave's daughter. So Dave, you can go and have your dram now.
Yeah.
Alan wouldn't share his EDX, so I'm drinking a 30-year-old Tomintel.
I'll send a miniature up to you.
Thank you, Alan. And congratulations to Jim and Linda as well for
as ever.
For everything they've done, because they're a lovely couple, and for lasting 2 hours listening to us.
On that note, let's say goodbye. Thanks very much, guys.
Bye.
Okay, bye guys. Bye everyone.